Hello and welcome everybody, the Freak is near and it's time to talk about Mythic Plus dungeons. They are a very popular type of content in World of Warcraft and I do enjoy them myself very much, but considering Blizz promised to create dungeons with Mythic Plus in mind for BFA, we now have to judge. So are they good enough? Let's have a look. So what do I mean by are they good enough? Well, that's a pretty subjective thing, and essentially I will be giving my opinion on them here, but what I mean by that is, are Mythic Plus dungeons good enough to be considered in their own right a fun, well-structured and relevant type of content? They have lots of pros, but also some cons and some things that are just blatantly wrong, and I'll do my best to be as objective as possible, focusing on the bad in order to find room for improvement. So let's now fuck about and quickly go through some of the major pros, the good shit. From their inception in Legion, the purpose of Mythic Plus dungeons was to give you something to do at level cap while not raiding. Something to fill up your time and also give you a chance at progressing your character with gear. This system allows you to significantly increase the difficulty of dungeons using mythic keystones and essentially allows you to farm them forever, since your keystone is always replaced at the end of the dungeon. This means that Blizz also get to reuse dungeons for endgame purposes, as opposed to only leveling and pre-raid. That way development wouldn't be wasted for these dungeons, as they would previously in other expansions become irrelevant after only the first few weeks. And Mythic Plus has been very successful. It's pretty easy to come up with 5 people for a dungeon with the group finder tool, and dungeons themselves have always been a staple of the game. So the community welcomed this new system and quickly integrated it in their weekly progression. Add to that the fact that dungeons for the past 3 expansions have been quite literally stunning, visually and thematically, and the boss fights have been really good. Mostly. I'm looking at you, Snake Boy. You time-wasting piece of shit. All in all, this was a perfect recipe for a very popular piece of content. I would also like to add that I like the way you need to take your character to the actual dungeon in order to start it. It's really not that big of a deal, but in a world where queues and instant teleportation rule the game, you can sometimes forget that you're actually playing an MMORPG in a living, breathing world. And this adds a little bit of weight to that world, even though it's very, very little. And now, let's talk about the bad, and I will start with the difficulty spike. It's bad enough that the game does an extremely poor job at teaching you how to play the game, and sometimes an even worse one at describing how things are supposed to work. But then you also have a pretty terrible upgrade system to your keystone. Now, I'm gonna suck my own dick for a moment here and say that if the difficulty spikes up a little bit for me, I can handle it pretty well. So this isn't really an issue for me personally. Yay me. But picture this. Picture a tank who was rather new to the game, and he does a mythic dungeon, which is pretty easy to complete without much regard to the mechanics. It's pretty much the old heroic dungeons we used to have in Mists. So he gets a +2 keystone, and I'll use Wowhead for this example and say this week would be Fortified, Sanguine and Necrotic. So at this point, if he wants to do the +2, he will only have to deal with Fortified. That's 20% more health and 30% more damage added to trash mobs. Slightly more difficult, but hardly any noticeable difference. Which means, once again, it will be pretty easy to complete, disregarding most mechanics. But if he completes it fast enough, which again, not that hard due to the ease of dungeons and the problem with overgearing, he will suddenly get a +5 keystone. Now, what does that mean? That means the Fortified boost to trash, another 26% damage and health added to everything, so trash and bosses, and Sanguine, where every trash mob leaves a shit puddle. When they die, that damages you and heals enemies. So in this hypothetical scenario, if our newbie tank that hardly had to think about what he was doing up until now is thinking about doing the +5, he'll all of a sudden need to reliably start using his personal defensive cooldowns and take into account things like positioning and pulling only certain packs. Things that he was just never required to even think about before. I created this hypothetical scenario in my head because it's the only way I can explain why some people are so oblivious to what's going on in the dungeon and end up making things so much harder for themselves because of it. Most tanks with no experience tend to pull everything they see because that's how it works, all the way up from level 1 to level cap. But it doesn't work that way in Mythic Plus. And some tanks, even when they realize that they're far too ahead of everybody, will just justify their overpulling by saying, we need to move faster to finish in time. You need to keep up with me fucking up. And this is not just a tank thing, it's all roles and classes. Healers that never dispel and who always have trouble keeping up if more than 2 people take damage at the same time. And sometimes, some fucking times, you get that one healer that does this incredible thing where they cast heals during fights, but for some reason, people's healths just slowly go down. From pull to pull, just slowly, ever so slowly, everyone is just dying. And you check him to see what happened, cause maybe it's not his fault. He did keep up with everybody and he isn't behind us running all the time. So maybe the tank didn't wait enough for him to drink between pulls. Maybe he just went out of mana. So you check him and he's full mana. And I just wanna kill myself. DPS just standing in all the shit, and Christ forbid that hybrid classes would ever use their healing to help others or dispel things in general. This might all seem like petty observations about inexperienced players, but this is actually a serious issue because every one of these mistakes, individually, they aren't gonna fuck up the dungeon timer, but together, they do add up, and it's the main reason why so many pugs, me and my friends and my guildmates queue up with, end up failing the timer. Even when overgearing the fucking thing. And they will fuck up all the way up to the end of the dungeon, if they can even be bothered to complete it. Because as we all know, if you fail the timer, now you're really fucked up. Even though you still get loot at the end of the dungeon. Regardless. I think it's interesting what effect the timer has on people's perception of the dungeon, but I'll segue into that a bit later. I think the upgrade should be as it was in Legion, where if you completed a keystone in time, you get +1 upgrade. If you fail the timer, you get a -1. And not only that, I would like to see an incentive created by Blizzard to farm these dungeons in a row. What do I mean by that? Most groups, when they form to do a dungeon, they only do the one dungeon and then immediately leave. Even though the group finder tool is something I find far superior to LFG, it still kind of does the same thing as LFG. It helps you create a group of random people that will never have to interact with each other once done. But if you add something like a daily or a weekly objective, where let's say you do 3 mythics of +2 or +3 difficulty, and you get some gold for it, people would start making groups for these objectives specifically, and might learn a thing or two if they stick around for long enough. Then you could have these rewards tiered based around the affixes, so completing 3 dungeons of +2 or +3 difficulty would mean you're doing tier 1 levels of difficulty because you're only dealing with fortified or tyrannical affix. Completing 3 dungeons of +4 to +6 would be the second tier because you deal with fortified, tyrannical, and a new affix, and so on. This would be important not only to give players a reason to socialize, which could end up in some experienced players teaching less experienced ones how to do stuff, but to also learn mechanics from repetition, because the most important element of learning is repetition. It's the foundation, and yes, you can say that the way you do it now is also repetition because you're still doing dungeons and that's it, but it's also important how you lay out that repetition, otherwise it just becomes a mess, a blur of animations and spell effects that just pop up all over your screen and you have no idea what any of them are doing and you learn nothing. Now, going back a bit to what I was saying earlier about the timer. I hate it. That's about it. It's more of a personal grudge, really, because whenever I look at that stupid timer, it always takes me back to math class on a test day with a pencil in my hand and shit in my pants. It's just not a great feeling, and I'm curious to know if there are others out there that feel like the difficulty should stand in being able to complete the dungeon to begin with, and not something as arbitrary as you didn't do it fast enough. You fucked up. Like I said, you still get loot at the end, so technically you still win, but for whatever reason, there's that added pressure that just gets some people lose their fucking shit if we don't move fast enough. And some people quitting if there's even a slight hint of failure. Regardless, there are definitely issues in the game far greater than this, and it wouldn't surprise me if this wasn't on Blizzard's priority list. But if keystones were to upgrade by only one level regardless, they could add some type of currency that could upgrade your keystone before you use it, so that when you use it and beat the timer faster, it upgrades +3 instead of +1. So essentially the same thing we have now, but only make it optional for those who want to push high keys really fast. I think it's important for people to have prolonged exposure to certain mechanics before being pushed ahead. And yes, you do have the option to tank your key, but we're talking about new players here that hardly know how to play the class and sometimes hardly even know how to get to the dungeon. Now, speaking of upgrading your keystone, I think it would be cool if you could upgrade it to somehow also give you additional materials, like maybe creating an item using the profession you need the materials for to upgrade your keystone. Your followers from the mission table can use something like that. Why do, once again, followers get more interesting things than us the players? That's a bit mean, but I hope my point has been made. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, and probably the biggest issue, is the gear reward. It has already been made abundantly clear by pretty much fucking everyone and their dog and their fucking dog's plushie that Azerite gear and its acquirement is fucked. Not only that, but Blizzard have been saying that they're moving in another direction with Azerite gear and their Azerite necklace progression, so who knows how that's gonna work out. By patch 8.2, this might be a completely new point. But for my peace of mind, I'd like to at least point out a few things. Ever since Mythic Plus was introduced, the question was brought up. If I can get the same item level gear in dungeons as I could get in Mythic raiding, what's the point of raiding? And I get it. Because of this question, a decision had to be made. A separation from dungeons to raiding. Because of this question and the blunder of itemization at the beginning of Legion, Azerite gear was born. You can have a little bit of Azerite gear from dungeons to get you started. But if you want to have the real deal, you must go raid. Must have been the thought behind this decision, and it wouldn't have been much of an issue if the traits weren't so fucked that you couldn't tell which ones of them are useful or not, and you could not reliably test them all because you could not reliably acquire them all at the same level. Now, my question is, would it have been so terrible to have Azerite gear only drop from dungeons? You know, the only items that they specifically said they wanted us to have several of to be added to the most reliable place to get loads of gear, Mythic plus farming. And I mean really only have Azerite gear dropping from dungeons and the rest of everything else from raiding. I mean, this might sound kind of crazy, but would that really be much of a problem? You can't even say it's exclusionary. There's fucking LFR. Everybody can do it. The really glaring issue, I think, with something like this, of course, is that you would have to farm the same items from the same dungeons throughout the entire expansion. Which is what we're currently doing anyway. And the crazy thing, I think, is you can farm Mythic Plus dungeons indefinitely. Because like I said, your keystone gets changed at the end of the dungeon, each time. And not only that, but even if you somehow completely deplete your own keystone, or you somehow delete it, you can just queue up to someone else's keystone. This in turn translates to a potential infinite amount of gear available to you. And because of this, Blizz have skewed the reward system as much as possible, I think. I really do believe that this is the reason why they have such bad and generic itemization and why you have so much RNG in the rewarding. Because if items were meaningful and you wanted to target any of them in BFA, you would quickly come to the conclusion it's a very unrealizable goal. And by the time you get that item that you really wanted, something way better is gonna come along and your effort was wasted. The best example I can give for this is the 2-piece set from Waycrest for casters, the ring and the trinket. I had those drop on my priest, which I don't play very often, but they were all low item level, and immediately some other ring procs Titan Forged from emissary chests. Emissary chests. And I fucked up my bonus set because of it, because the ring also had better stats, so I needed to equip it, and I think it also had a socket. I can't even remember for sure because I can't give a shit about my gear this expansion. Here's a simple way I see can attempt to mend this, and it wouldn't take huge development time and it wouldn't really change the game all that much. How about if in a certain week you do Waycrest Manor M+ more than any other dungeon. At the end of that week, in your reward chest, you're guaranteed an item from Waycrest Manor. Simple, right? Hardly changes anything about the game, just changes a little bit the way you want to do your weekly farm. I think you would still need backlog protection even with something like this, because the weekly reward just haunts my fucking dreams at this point, considering it gave me the same shitty fucking offhand for like 3 weeks in a row, from a pool of dozens of items. Speaking of the weekly chips drops, funny little thing I realized after getting that fucking offhand. Remember how Blizz said that you would pretty much be guaranteed an Azurite gear item from the chest? Well, for some reason I have been getting none for the past couple of weeks, and I had no idea why. And to be honest, I didn't pay much attention to it until one day I just randomly watched the Mythic Plus window and read, "Your weekly chest will contain an item level 410 reward." And that's when it just randomly clicked in my head. Azurite gear has fixed item levels, and it doesn't item forge. And I have only been farming +10 dungeons or more. So unless I specifically farm maximum +8 dungeons, I'm shooting myself in the fucking foot. What? This one is the one that most boggles my mind. Is this intentional? Am I missing something? It's the one issue that makes me question myself as a human being, because it's like, am I so fucking stupid that I'm missing something really obvious? Or is this just really completely fucked? Anyway, I have been rambling on for quite a while now, and by now you're probably thinking Mythic Dungeons. Ugh, sounds terrible. But the reality is that they are not bad. They are quite good. Like I said, the boss fights are mostly fun, and the affixes do add an interesting enough dynamic to the dungeon. Yes, some of them are much more demanding than others, like necrotic or explosive, but the classes have ways of dealing with them pretty efficiently, if you know what you're doing, and you know how to form a group based around what you need. All in all, I do think it's a fun and worthwhile system, and I'm happy that Blizz decided to keep it from Legion into BFA. A lot of issues that I have with them mostly stem from other parts of the game that are suffering from design issues, which is why there isn't just one feature of the game that you can point at and say, if this is removed, WoW would become better. And that's why I'm making this series of videos. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Did I hit my mark with my complaints and you want to shake my hand and call me a good chap? Or did I miss so hard that I should just become an organ donor? I would really like to know that.